The PSBA is committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity work. As an organization founded in Tacoma, Washington, we acknowledge the Puyallup tribe and invite you to visit the official website of the Puyallup and listen to their land acknowledgement statement. The Puyallup people have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to offering opportunities to uplift the voices, experiences, and histories of the Indigenous people of this land and beyond.
Welcome, everyone, to our celebration of another year of PSBA. I know this is an annual meeting and we've got a business meeting, but it really is celebrating all of the things that we have done and all of the work that you have helped us with. And now we're going to turn it over to Jane, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, Belinda. And it is my pleasure to introduce this year's annual meeting speaker, Yuka Petz. For many of you, she needs no introduction. She is a deeply engaged and influential voice in the book arts community in our region and beyond. Yuka is a visual artist and writer whose creative practice centers on language, heritage, paper, and letter forms. For several years, she has hosted Artist Books Unshelved, a video series offering in-depth explorations of artist books from the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. And she also teaches youth and adult workshops nationwide. Her artist books and prints are held in numerous special collections, and her work is grounded in collaboration, community, and expanding access to book, print, and paper arts. She holds an MFA in book arts and printmaking from the University of Arts in Philadelphia and a BFA in graphic design from the Rhode Island School of Design. Yuka has just returned from Codex, where she moderated a panel focused on the exhibition, Who is America at 250? Artist Books on the State of Democracy, which she also co-curated. The exhibition brings together artist books and print work from across the country to explore both the realities and perceptions of life in the United States today, addressing urgent issues such as immigration, social injustice, racial inequality, and wage inequality, while also examining the enduring idea of America as a land of opportunity. We are so fortunate to have the opportunity to learn more about Yuka's personal work and her creative practice today. So please join me in welcoming Yuka.
Thank you, Jane, and to PSBA for inviting me to join everyone today. I'm thrilled and honored and excited to have a little time to share with you. As Jane mentioned in the introduction, I have done and continue to do a lot of things, ranging from writing about artists' books, collaborating to create community art organizations and events, designing books, binding books, and some curatorial work. But today I'm excited to focus on sharing my own creative practice, specifically my work investigating language and text. If you've ever come to one of my talks before, you might recognize this image. I took this photo while living in Japan from 2003 to 2005. I like to share it because it captures so many of the things that I love: text, gorgeous textures, mark of the hand, movement in the brushstrokes, this idea of change over time, the shift between foreground, background, positive and negative space, and that external factors like time and weather influence the way a surface changes, bringing out something even more beautiful or compelling than it originally was. And this is a quick image just to show you the full sign as it appeared, and the detail I took is from the bottom. So this was in, I think it was in Kumamoto, and there were maybe 4 or 5 signs along this building. I made my first book in the 3rd grade. It was a few pages stapled together and covered with cardboard and wrapping paper and contact paper. That's the moment I fell in love with making books. I learned about artist books in nerd camp. I worked at a book bindery in high school, and I studied graphic design as an undergrad because I wanted to make better books. While I was living in Japan, the same time when I took that photo I showed you before, I was taking calligraphy classes, and if you've ever done calligraphy, you may know that you end up with many practice sheets. So I cut up those practice sheets and made a few different accordion books with them, piecing them back together, thinking about the positive and negative space and the interaction between the shapes of the letters. Influenced by my typography education, this is the first book where I started breaking apart text and letter forms and putting them back together, just to explore, just to see. And I think I made about 5 or 6 of these. Oop. In graduate school, I continued breaking language apart. This is noun, which is an exquisite corpse of words and their definitions. While reading the dictionary one day, as one does, I realized that definitions have a structure. It's the thing that does this other thing. And I selected 27 words to play with the words and their definitions. So here you can see 3 successive spreads from this book. At the top is the word umbrella, and the definition is a shade or screen or guard carried in the hand for sheltering one from the rain. At the bottom, you can see one of the other original words, whisper, a low, sibilant utterance spoken softly or under the breath. But as you flip the left and right pages, you can mix and match the words and their definitions. So here is whisbrella in the middle, a low, sibilant utterance for sheltering from wind and rain. And so mixing and matching the left and right halves of the words and definitions creates delightful nonsense. And this is actually the last book I'm going to share with you today, although I will say that everything that's coming is very much grounded in the book and language, from paper to text, graphite, printing, and beyond. Around the time I made Noun, I was exploring breaking up words in different ways, such as layering letters of the word on top of each other. So this is actually the familiar pangram, the quick fox jumps over a lazy brown dog. If you look at the top left shape, you might be able to see it's the word the. The T was drawn first, the H was drawn on top of the T, and the E was drawn on top of the H. All the way on the right, you might be able to recognize the word fox. Might be able to make out the F, the O, and the X. So this piece is actually that sentence, that pangram repeated twice. The quick fox jumps over a lazy brown dog, and there's a gap in the middle where it's repeated again. And so the left side is starting from front to back, so drawing the T, then the H, then the E, and the right side is moving in the opposite direction, putting the E down first, and then the H, and then the T. So in this piece, I was just starting to put letters in different dimensions, in different relationships to dimensional space. This piece is from my graduate thesis exhibition, and I'd long been interested in the action of reading and how we identify text or letters. Again, studied graphic design, no surprise there. In this piece, I wanted to explore the space words or letters take up. I made boxes that stand in for each letter in this quote I found, which is the title of the piece. The most important things are the hardest to say because words diminish them. So in the detail on the bottom, you might be able to recognize the word important. With the I, there's after that little gap, there's the letter I, small and thin. And then there's the wide M to the right of that. And you might be able to recognize the descending P, the third letter there. All of these boxes are made with overbeaten abaca, which shrinks a lot when it's drying. And like that Japanese sign I showed you at the beginning, there are natural forces or actions outside of my control that I can suggest how I want them to behave. But at some point, I'm giving up some level of that control. And here's just a closer detail of those boxes. So you can see there's actually not just width and height, but there's also depth in relation to the letters. So on the left, I think that's an L maybe. But with this piece, this is really where I started to move much more seriously into sculptural work. While making those little boxes, I was also trying to bring text off of the page and existing in the space, the same three-dimensional space that you and I inhabit. This is something that carried forward into my future work. There are vacancies in that large black hanging paper where the letters are removed. I built a paper letter dropper, which you can see just at the top there. And that sits behind the black paper, slowly releasing letters that flutter down and accumulate at the bottom. These aren't just letters, though, they're actually phonemes. So phonemes are representations of sound in written form. And I chose to depict them in my cursive hand because at that time I was really interested in connecting the written form of sound to the movement of the hand. So I was really interested in language and the body. So this video gives you a brief overview of the piece, and you can't hear it, but there's these delightful little taps that happen when those letters fall on the floor and echo through that space. And here's just another detail of this piece in a couple spots. And there's magical moments like that letter on the lower right that got caught in the paper, almost like it didn't really want to leave the paper, maybe. But in this piece, I started moving away from the confines of words and actual texts. Moving forward, I rarely worked with existing texts again because I'm not making illustrations of a text. I'm not even commenting or responding to a specific book or an essay. I'm examining our relationship with text and imagining what it is for language to move between people or across time. So I constantly imagine how letters act or move when given corporeality or a 3D body outside of the confines of the page. For a few more years, I was still really interested in phonemes, like these written representations of sound in the English words. Like the cursive falling letters piece, I wanted to tie the movement of our bodies to the phonemes or sound. Connecting these different acts of making language from our bodies gives some sense of how the language might move. I continued working in ink and graphite to make drawings. And in this piece, these are all, there's actually three different representations for this, the sound like PH. There's actually F in the middle and then GH. And they're all overlapping each other, but fading away as they move in and out of body form. This is another exploration with phonemes, and this is actually an early piece that indicates how I would later come to use printmaking, although not exactly the same way. This is pulling successive ghost prints and pressure prints without re-inking the plate. For this piece, I embroidered over the darkest areas of the last pressure print, and the embroidery are hatch marks that track how the hand moves the brush or the pen while writing. The colors are representative of the category of the phoneme, such as a consonant digraph or a long vowel. But you can also see that I haven't quite let go of systems and organizing structures, things that I was really still holding tight onto. Let's see if it can play. It's playing great. But while I was doing this 2D work, I kept wanting to work with actual letters cut from paper. I love these. I love manipulating them. I love playing with them. When they're on my desk, I can't keep my hands out of them. I love that they exist in actual space with me, physical space with me. But I only had a limited amount of letters that I could keep reusing because they were expensive to produce. So I started experimenting with things like video, trying to get them off the page and moving in space, and not committing them to a single piece so I could keep reusing them. I've long been interested in letters because they are human symbols. Where other animals communicate in various ways, we have these systems of writing. But when letters are released from words, I also started to see them as representative of failure and potential at the same time. So in this video piece, distillation, accumulation, this was one of the next steps in thinking about text and language. The full video is about 7 minutes long, but this is a short clip that we can watch together. There's no audio with this video, and so I'll let the last 20 seconds or so play without talking over it. But I hope you'll see some of the magical moments of how these letters move independently of my own control. And since I didn't have an endless supply of these paper letters, I found ways to use them across my various media and practices. So those same letters that you just saw falling in waters are being used here to create monoprints on the letterpress. In this left photo, you can see the letters on the press. There's an inked block below that white paper. And when I run the press, it applies pressure to wherever those letters are, transferring more ink onto the paper. On the right side, you can see the resulting monoprint. This one's an early test, so it's a little bit dark, but hopefully gives a sense of how I'm making these monoprints, composing on the press, and moving letters around, physically engaging them in printmaking. Still thinking about how letters might move in space, I began looking towards natural phenomena such as swarming behavior, tornadoes, or geological formations. These became important reference points to insert letter forms and explore the movements or accumulations of language as well as silence. In the pandemic, I kept thinking about where language hides when we can't access it, perhaps in deep, craggy caverns or clinging to the insides of our arteries. Words get tangled, broken apart, and move across a space. And I kept asking myself, where does language and text go when imposed structures break down? I felt this acutely in the pandemic on a really personal level. As we were coming out of lockdown, communication and conversation was exhausting and elusive. But I also felt this on a broader societal level. Ideas and content were moving so quickly, and it felt really difficult to harness the uplifting and simultaneously devastating impacts of words. I'm going to make a little process side note here. Printmaking for me is often rather than an endpoint, it's actually more of a step in my research and exploratory processes. For example, I did a big series of screen print monoprints in 2021. And so here are two of those. They're printed with an open screen. So there's no burn screen. It's just flat open screen. And the ink can go all the way through. But what I do is I vary where I put the ink, as well as where and how I apply the pressure while I'm pulling the squeegee down the screen. What this effectively does is it leaves some of the ink in the screen, which then transfers to the next print and is responsible for these textures that you're seeing here that are generally not found in typical screen prints. And so I'm endlessly intrigued by this idea that the print before directly influences the next print and so on in the series. The resulting shapes, textures, and ideas directly inform my text-based prints and drawings. So I went back to pressure prints to explore this idea of printing in series. The leftmost detail is the first pressure print, made with some scraps of paper from another project. In the middle, you can see this is the monoprint that picks up the ghost of that first print on the left, but I've also put those letters on the paper. And so there's this pressure print now, and those letters are darker. They're printing darker. And then the final print on the right side is where I'm going. And so that's a ghost print of the middle print. So again, I'm working with residual ink because I want it to be tied to what came before, connecting it to memory and lineage. But I have a little more control with the pressure printing than I did with the screen printing. And here's a larger example of this process in a finished monoprint that I created it in Kahoot's residency, where I could work on a press much larger than the one I have at home. This one's about 18 by 24. I'm still exploring how language moves through spaces like caverns, arteries, and caves where it might collect. But there are textures and residual inks in this print, this monoprint, that actually come from prints made 2, 3, even 10 prints prior. A couple of years ago, I acquired a laser cutter so I could cut big quantities of my own letters and stop having to reuse them. And of course, when you cut letters out, you essentially have stencils left over, or I do anyway. So I returned to drawing, and one by one, I started drawing letters with pencil, slowly building up images. And one side note here is that, again, I'm not working with existing texts, but I am thinking about the English language. So the frequency that the letters appear is roughly in relationship to the frequency that they appear in the English language. So what that means is there are a lot more A's and E's in these drawings than X's or Q's. Where the prints tend to be of the earth or interior spaces, these pencil drawings turn more towards the air, inspired by swarms, murmurations, and other emergent behavior of flying animals. My graphite drawings can examine language moving unhindered through space. Again, here I see each letter as carrying that dual idea of failure and potential. These letters have fallen out of words, unable to be formed into language right now, but they could come together to create something that we could understand, or maybe not. But they do yet have the potential to be words and carriers of meaning. Here's a really large drawing, yet another tall or wide piece that doesn't photograph easily. These are 5 panels, and each one is 18 by 24 inches. But here, hopefully you can see in this detail, this is where the fourth and fifth panels meet, and you can kind of make out the jumble of the letters. And there's an energy in these overlapping lines that I can't access the same way in the prints and the pressure prints. So moving forward, I'm really interested in combining these 2D processes, and I plan to start drawing directly on top of my prints. But I'm never quite satisfied with two-dimensional work. I always miss working with my letters. So I go back and I explore them again, find new ways to see them. Often I photograph them in different environments just to see how they react. I really love this image on the top right, where this serif got caught on my sweater, and I lifted up my arm and it wanted to come with me. And I tell you, as long as I've worked with these cut paper letters, they follow me all around. I'll find them in unexpected places like outside my doorstep or tucked into my house shoes, and I'm always delighted to see them, especially in the space outside of my studio. I really like working sculpturally with these cut paper letters because compared to a drawing or a print, I find that I can harness an increased impact and emotional resonance with the viewer when they encounter a 3D letter released from the page. We're just not used to seeing letters existing independent of paper or books or even signs. It grabs us a little more than seeing letters still stuck to a substrate. This isn't the best documentation of this piece, but on the right are small scraps of handmade paper separated from the letters on the left. And here I'm very directly referencing the Codex book form, again with this undercurrent of failure and potential. And I like to share this detail because you can see that most of the time I actually pre-print textures onto these letters before I cut them out. I find that it's a really important step to help them manifest a little extra physicality and mood. Since I now have my own modest laser cutter, I don't have to keep reusing those same letters over and over, and I can commit them to individual pieces, which means I can glue them down. Even in that last piece I just showed you, I was still reusing those letters over and over from different pieces and different processes. So now that I can glue them down, I feel like I'm at an exciting opening for bringing these ideas into more emotive sculptural or 3D forms. And the last piece I want to share today is an installation I did at the Minnesota Center for Book Arts Outlook Window Gallery. This piece grew out of an experience I had in 2023 when I visited my maternal grandfather's hometown in Japan. Within hours of arriving, not knowing if any relatives still existed there, I found relatives who briskly welcomed me. We bonded over shared ancestors through a permeable language barrier. But these cousins knew a surprising amount about me and what I had done during my life. Someone had told them about me, but nobody told me about them, despite my inquiries. So, how did those relatives in Japan know so much about me? I actually still don't know. Answers weren't lining up, and the ground kind of shifted below me and what I thought I knew. So, this experience greatly informed this piece. The reality you were always a part of wasn't the reality you knew. I was fortunate to grow up with my Japanese grandparents in our multi-generational home in Virginia. My mom was the first to come to the US in the 1970s, and she brought my grandparents over in the 1980s. My mom grew up in Tokyo, but my grandfather's hometown was a small village that was one stop away from the origami factory in Tokushima, Japan. So here's a photo of me in 2004 at the origami factory in Tokushima doing a papermaking workshop where I made a few dozen sheets of washi. While I was there, I thought maybe I'd go that one train stop further and go visit my grandfather's hometown. But I didn't make it. I didn't have time. And when I made this paper, I had no connection to any of those relatives in town, despite a strong desire for it. I'd been told we no longer knew any relatives in the entire country, and that all connections had been lost. After I was All I was left was with a town name, sparse copies of documents and photos, and questions that ricocheted off impenetrable silence, developed over a half century of post-World War II xenophobia, immigration, and interclass and interracial marriages. Fast forward 20 years, and that paper that I made at Awagami became the basis of this installation in Minneapolis. In response to making connections with these Japanese relatives, who again knew so much about me, but I still don't know why or how, I decided to transform the washi sheets into paper thread, which is what I'm doing in this photo from 2024. There's the obvious metaphor of thread as a connector, but as I've said a few times already this afternoon, I'm obsessed with these ideas of failure and potential, and thread contains both. It contains so much potential, but it can break. It's both strong and weak, depending on the context. Cutting the folded paper, then wetting and rolling it are the first steps towards transforming a sheet of washi into kami-ito, into paper thread. These are pretty aggressive actions to take on a material like paper, simultaneously damaging it and strengthening it. Here's a photo of the three different steps towards making the paper thread. On the left, there's a very specific folding technique to fold the paper down so that you can cut it later. In the middle shows that cut paper. And then on the right is the paper after I've rolled it against the cement block slab, which we saw in the previous slide. And then after that step, you can actually cut it a certain way and even spin this paper into thread. I had originally intended to transform all of this paper into thread, but when I opened up that rolled sheet of washi, I absolutely fell in love with it just as it is. And you can see that on the left. I hung it up at my studio wall. I didn't want to take it onto thread anymore because this now is somewhere between paper and thread. And in that process of transformation, it felt exactly right for the moment where my understanding of my family changed quite suddenly, but not because I suddenly had all of this new information that gave me answers. In fact, it made things make less sense, and I couldn't piece together this new information. I also loved how this material now kind of evokes lined paper, and it had that beautiful drape. So I transformed all 20 or so sheets of washi that I had made at Awagami and that I had been carrying around for 2 decades because they were far too precious to use for anything. And then I adhered them together. And so on the right image, you can see them uh, glued together and drying on the floor of my old studio. So here again is that full installation viewed from the outside. You can see the hanging paper in the left side image. And that long strip twists and turns and kind of flips over as it approaches the floor. In the right image, you can see the piles and scatters of paper that are on the floor. I have many skills, but I'm still fairly new to making paper thread, so sometimes they break. And I love those dangling strips. I very quickly decided not to tie them back together because they're so resonant with my experience of trying to find my family history, meeting walls of silence, and recognizing that time and people have passed such, and there are some answers I will never have because those lines have been broken. Things like I'd always known that my grandfather is one of 4 brothers, but when I met my mom's cousins, they informed me that he had a sister who died in her 20s. I've never heard of that sister. When I got home, I scoured my grandfather's photo albums, and I haven't found any photos or mention of her. I don't know why she's missing from my grandfather's careful documentation, and I doubt I'll ever know. On the floor of this installation are piles of letters. The dark blue, the ones that you see most of, those are all English, and they spread and collect across the floor. And these red, yellow, and green piles are Japanese. So these are hiragana, which is the phonetic character set for Japanese words. These colors are significant. They connect to colors I associate with Japan from the vantage of my American childhood. My mom spoke English to me growing up. She didn't raise me speaking Japanese, but I did communicate in Japanese with my grandparents because that's all they spoke until they passed away. Since I only spoke with my family, I'm a heritage speaker. My language skills are limited, and I accidentally used child language until I had been living in Japan for a little while in my 20s. Even now, I still accidentally use children's language and I use some outdated words because there's a big midsection in my teen and young adult years where, lacking a Japanese community to develop my Japanese language skills, my language, the words I know, are stuck in time. I've since studied on my own and continued my own language learning. I'm not fluent, but I can get pretty far. But the disconnect of language is just one of those many losses that can happen in just one generation. I'm pretty sure this installation is a turning point in my work. Honestly, it kind of scares me. Bringing in my personal experience and stories much more overtly than I had before. Those feelings and those personal experiences are in all of the work that I showed you earlier, but here it's, at least to me, it seems a lot more vulnerable and direct. So what's next? Um, my mother gave me copies of the 2 books my grandfather wrote in the early 1970s. I've started translating them. You can see on the left is my notes, the top left is my notes, and then you can see my grandfather's book cover to the right there with the spirals. Love that like late 60s, early 70s design. I'm not really looking to republish his book or anything. It's about labor in the construction industry, but I am just looking for his voice wherever I can find it. I have a residency at the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology coming up, And I look forward to researching sites of convergence, void or emptiness, and evidence of change over time in these abundant ecosystems in the Oregon coast. Hopefully, these will inform the next evolution of prints, drawings, sculptural work, and my sculptural work on paper. And perhaps I might return to books. I'm also just going to revisit compulsions and material studies. I moved to Portland last year, and I haven't quite been able to finish unpacking my studio. These things take time. Um, but I am looking forward to seeing the things that I've squirreled away, like these two things on the bottom left. I made these probably 4 or 5 years ago, and they're torn pieces of abaca paper sewn back together with hair, with my hair, collected before I cut my hair short. I am not sure what these studies are going to lead to or what else I'll find. Maybe they won't lead anywhere, but these things that I was compelled to make often make a lot more sense a few years later, and then I can translate them into a finished piece. And as I conclude sharing my work around language, paper, and text, I want to revisit this image. I actually hadn't looked at this photo in a while before putting this presentation together for today. And man, I mean, I could just sit here and forget that you're all in this Zoom room, and I could just get lost in this image. I get lost in it every single time I look at it. There's so much for me to find here, like the way time and external forces have altered the sign, shifting the figure in the ground. I think about it most recently in the way that my ground was shifted through the discoveries that I made meeting my relatives in Japan. I never tire of this image, and I can see how every single piece I make comes back to and aspires to be this weathered sign. Maybe someday I can make something that hits all the marks as much as this sign does. Thank you.
Yuka, thank you so much for that incredibly thoughtful and well-organized presentation. I have so many thoughts jumbled in my mind right now, and I really find it so impactful that you have explored so many different ways to integrate the letters into your work. And as you were showing some of the images, I thought to myself, how does she make all of these letters? So, particularly in that installation with the piles of letters, I was just thinking about the complexity of shipping that and creating that work. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process? It was
Yeah, well, it actually collapses fairly small,
okay.
because the big hanging sheet with all the washi, that actually I can roll up carefully. And then the letters, all of those letters were cut on my laser cutter. While I do enjoy cutting things by hand, at some point there is, that reaches into a ludicrous level of of commitment. So those are all laser cut. And again, they just fit. I think the blue is probably 1.5 like gallon Ziploc bags full. And then the other colors just go into their own separate bags. And so it's actually maybe like the box is maybe half the size of me in shipping it, which was an important consideration because I had to get it to Minneapolis and then back.
Absolutely. I love your comment about the most important things to say are often the hardest to say. Other reflections of how you held on to that paper that you made for so long and finding inspiration in work that you've had in the studio and rethinking it. So just so many thoughtful ways of putting together art. I know that we might have some questions from our members, but might I ask you a little bit, kind of moving on about your process in co-curating the wonderful exhibit that's now on display in San Francisco?
Oh, sure. Um, yeah, so that exhibit, I was so Betty Bright reached out to me as she had been developing the idea for this exhibit for a little while, and she put together a team of co-curators. So that included Mark Diminution, Ruth Rogers, who's over at Wellesley, and Maimuna Farhat, who's another independent curator. And Betty kind of managed the organizing. She developed the structure for how we would co-curate that show. And it's an interesting process and where there's many voices coming together and different ideas. Five voices is a lot of voices to create one cohesive show. Um, but it was a joy to work with all of these really is like great professionals in the field, and I was particularly excited to bring works that I don't think they would have seen and to advocate for some of the pieces really strongly in that collection.
That's great. I hope maybe someday that exhibit can make it to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, wouldn't that be lovely?
That
Yeah,
would be so cool.
it's traveling to Boston and then the Minnesota Center for Book Arts. It'll be at the Boston Athenaeum, then Minnesota Center for Book Arts, and it was supposed to travel to Georgia, but the host institution had to cut it because of funding due to our current
That's such a
administration's.
shame. Well, we can
Yes.
keep our fingers crossed. Jesse Wing put a comment in the chat about your love of letters. Does this or how has Japanese calligraphy influenced you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I had a slide in that I removed earlier, but often when I'm returning to my studio after a little time away, I don't really know what to do. And so I just start moving my hands. And one of the important things that I do there is I just start making the marks, the base marks in Japanese calligraphy. And they rarely seem to come back in to the work, but they are always always an entry point to the text and back into these ideas.
Do you practice calligraphy yourself?
Sometimes. I would love to find a teacher because my when I studied it was while I was living in Japan. It was just this really lovely community group. Pretty much I was the only person under 60, and they were so great, but at that point my Japanese was moderate, not to the level of and they most of them didn't speak English. So I think that there's some ideas there that I'd really like to um, explore a little bit more and kind of learn more deeply. And actually, the those screen print monoprints that I showed, those are also really looking a lot at uh, Japanese landscape painting. So I do go back to a lot of Japanese art history and revisit it from time to time.
That's great. We have a question from Judith Christensen, and she says, watching the presentation, one of the characteristics that stand out to me is how much movement is incorporated or expressed in your work, not just the falling letters, but also how the static pieces appear. Can you expand on the connection between movement and language, paper, and text in your work?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, good
That's one of those
question,
million
Judith.
dollar questions. Way to go. Yeah, well, it started because I really I think as we move closer, further digital, I actually probably am like of the last of the generation that would handwrite essays and then wrote things on the typewriter before we moved to computers. So I, I felt all of these shifts in how we communicate with text in a very concise era of my education and my childhood. So I think a lot about how our bodies are connected to these things and what that what those different ways our body interact, what that reflects on how we engage with words and language and text. So that was something I was thinking a lot about in the early works. But then rather than just thinking of the body as a movement to create it, a shift happened where I think about letters as herds. I really do. They're like herds of creatures to me, and I want to see how they move and like what is it's a crazy thing that I can say these words and you can understand what I'm thinking. And so how does that work? What does that look like? How do I imagine and visualize the ways that letters might move because I don't actually believe that they're going to move the same way in the same space all the time. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I I'm reminded of the visual of the video, which is quite mesmerizing. Like I could watch that for hours. That was
me
really
too.
intriguing. We have one more question from Catherine Alice, and she asks, when you go back to Japan, will you continue your research or explore additional or more of these ideas?
Yeah, yes, I am actually going back for with my family at the end of March, and that'll be a little bit more of seeing friends and family kind of trip. But I'm really looking forward to maybe not being caught so off guard this time, and being able to be a little bit more focused. I also this all of this work that I've shown you is very much from my grandfather's side. And I have even less information about my grandmother's side, but sparing you the long story of how she was, from this wealthy family and he's this poor farmer who was really smart. Um, there's there's a lot of rich background that I'd like to try to find my way through. But as I've been moving through this work, I've been taking classes with this author, Kim Jang, she calls it memory work. And she's a writer, often in sort of non-standard forms. And one of the things she has continually encouraged me and her other students to do is to look past the factual information that we can find, like look past the archives, because the archives are really only going to get you so far. Whether that's your grandparents' photo album or, documents in the city archives or whatever. And she has pushed very hard for us to use fiction to find our way to our family's stories and find our way through these silences, which are, I think, common in a lot of families, but especially in Asian cultures. Um, and boy, is that hard for me. So I think my hope is that with this next trip, where I may not be necessarily looking through archives in as much, I'm hoping to think more about each place and maybe try to pull that in with this effort to use fictional writing to find some answers.
Fascinating. That sounds so great. And I know with archives, we often say what isn't available is equally as telling as what is available. So I think that your approach, we can't wait to see the results in perhaps a new series of books. But we want to thank you so much for joining us. And we're so fortunate to have your expertise in the Pacific Northwest and your work on curating shows and talking about artist books and learning from you. I'm sure we will all look at letters very differently after today. So thank you so much, Yuka. We really appreciate it.
It's been an honor to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.